This is not the story most people think of when they hear the name Iraq. They think of invasion, smoke, sanctions, militias, oil fields, and ruined skylines. But long before Iraq became shorthand for war, it was the place where human civilization learned how to stand on its own feet. This was the land where cities rose before most of the world had villages, where writing appeared not as decoration, but as administration, where law was carved into stone, where empires were built, broken, and built again. If you want to understand Iraq, you cannot begin with the 20th century. You have to begin 6,000 years earlier in the flat, unforgiving plain between two rivers, because Iraq is not just another country with an old past. It is one of the few places on Earth where history does not feel layered. It feels compressed, concentrated, almost violent in its intensity. In this one region, humans learned how to organize labor, measure time, record trade, manage harvests, build temples, rule strangers, and imagine power on a scale the world had never seen before. By the time the first Greek philosophers began asking what the universe was made of, the civilizations of Mesopotamia had already been rising and collapsing for 4,000 years. And that is the great irony at the heart of Iraq's story. The same land that helped invent civilization became one of the places most devastated by conquest, empire, and modern war. Nearly every great power of the ancient and modern worlds has marched through it. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, British, Americans. Some came to rule it, some came to loot it, none managed to erase it. To understand why this land has survived so much, you first have to understand the two rivers that made it possible. The story begins with geography. Two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flow down from the mountains of modern Turkey and run southeast toward the Persian Gulf. Around them lies one of the harshest environments on Earth, a world of heat, dust, and open plain. But between those rivers, something rare happened. Every flood season, the waters spilled over their banks and left behind thick, dark silt, rich soil capable of feeding large populations year after year. In a region that should have resisted dense human settlement, the rivers created an agricultural engine. That engine changed everything. Once food could be produced in surplus, people no longer had to spend every waking hour simply surviving. Some could farm, others could build, others could store grain, manage labor, trade goods, guard temples, and organize public works. The first great shift in human society was not just that people settled down. It was that they could stay in one place long enough to become more than a settlement. They could become a system. The ancient Greeks would later call this region Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers. But for the people who lived there, it was more than a geographic label. It was the center of possibility. Water made agriculture possible. Agriculture made surplus possible. Surplus made hierarchy, specialization, religion, trade, and government possible. The logic of civilization formed here step by step, but on a scale and at a speed that changed the course of human history. This is why Iraq matters so much to the story of the world. Not because it was merely old, but because it was foundational. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates did not just host early civilization. It created the conditions that allowed civilization to emerge in the first place. And in the south of that river plain, a people called the Sumerians would turn those conditions into the first cities the world had ever seen. In southern Mesopotamia, that system took visible form for the first time. Around 6,000 years ago, the Sumerians began building something the human world had never seen before: cities. Not oversized villages, not scattered farming communities, but true urban centers with temples, storehouses, workshops, priests, rulers, laborers, and social ranks. Places like Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, and Lagash were not simply places where people lived. They were organized worlds with identities of their own. Among them, Uruk became something extraordinary. By around 3500 BC, it may have held tens of thousands of people, making it likely the largest city on Earth at the time. That matters because once a population reaches that scale, everything changes. You need systems to distribute food, direct labor, settle disputes, maintain temples, and track goods. A city is not just a concentration of people. It is a concentration of complexity, and complexity demands record-keeping. That is where one of the greatest turning points in human history occurred. Sometime around 3400 BC, Sumerian scribes began pressing reed styluses into wet clay tablets to record transactions, inventories, and stored grain. Writing did not begin as poetry. It did not begin as philosophy. It began as information management. One of humanity's most revolutionary inventions emerged from a practical problem. How do you keep track of a growing society? That insight tells you something profound about civilization itself. Before people wrote epics, they wrote numbers. Before they wrote myths, they wrote receipts. The earliest written marks were tied to administration, agriculture, taxation, and accountability. In other words, writing was born because cities needed memory stronger than the human mind. The Sumerians were not done. They built towering temple platforms called ziggurats that dominated the flat plain for miles. They developed a mathematical system based on 60, a system that still shapes your life every time you check the time or measure a circle. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not modern conventions. They are ancient Mesopotamian inheritances. But Sumer had one weakness. It was brilliant, wealthy, and inventive, yet politically divided. It was a world of rival city-states, each proud, independent, and often at war with the others. And that division would open the door for the next great transformation in Iraqi history. That transformation came from the north. The Sumerian city-states had created wealth, culture, and the machinery of urban civilization, but they had never solved the problem of unity. They competed, raided, and weakened one another. Then, in around 2334 BC, a ruler named Sargon of Akkad did something no one before him had fully achieved. He conquered the Sumerian cities one by one and brought them under a single authority. In doing so, he created what many historians consider the world's first true empire. This was more than a military victory. It was a new political idea. A city could dominate its neighbors, but an empire ruled over many cities, many peoples, and a much larger geography. Under Sargon, power was no longer confined to a local temple economy or a single urban center. It stretched across regions. Orders traveled farther. Administration became more ambitious. For the first time, Mesopotamia was not just a cluster of civilizations. It was a civilization under one ruler. At its height, the Akkadian Empire reached from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean. That scale mattered because it changed how power was imagined. Rule was no longer just about defending one city's walls. It became about controlling roads, tribute, labor, distant populations, and communication across vast territory. The empire turned Mesopotamia from the birthplace of cities into the birthplace of imperial government. And within that imperial world emerged one of the most remarkable figures of the ancient age, Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon. Installed as high priestess in the city of Ur, she wrote hymns in her own name, making her the earliest known named author in human history. The first author whose voice we can identify was not Greek, not Roman, but a woman from ancient Iraq. Yet even the First Empire could not escape the pattern that would define this land for millennia. Expansion brought strain. Internal unrest grew. Climate pressures likely weakened agriculture. By around 2150 BC, the Akkadian Empire had collapsed. But Mesopotamia did not fall silent. In Iraq, collapse was never the end of the story. It was usually the beginning of the next one. Out of the shifting power struggles that followed Akkad's collapse, Babylon slowly emerged as the next great center of Mesopotamian history. And with Babylon came a ruler whose name would outlive nearly every king of the ancient world, Hammurabi. He came to the throne around 1792 BC, not as the master of a giant empire, but as the ruler of a kingdom still surrounded by rivals. For years, he did not rush into reckless conquest. He strengthened canals, reinforced alliances, stabilized the economy, and governed carefully. Only later did he begin the campaigns that brought much of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. That patience is part of what made Hammurabi important. He was not remembered simply because he won wars. Many kings won wars. He was remembered because he transformed victory into order. After expanding Babylon's power, Hammurabi commissioned one of the most famous legal monuments in history. A massive stone stele inscribed with nearly 300 laws dealing with property, trade, labor, marriage, inheritance, injury, and punishment. The message was clear. Power was no longer only personal. It was written, displayed, and made visible. This was revolutionary. A ruler's authority had existed before, but Hammurabi gave law a durable public form. The famous phrase, "an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," comes from this world, and it still echoes in legal and moral debates thousands of years later. The code was far from equal by modern standards. Punishments differed by class, and social hierarchy remained deeply embedded in the law. But even so, the code represented a major shift in human society. It assumed that conflict could be regulated, contracts could be enforced, and power could be expressed through a system rather than pure impulse. That is why Babylon matters so much. Under Hammurabi, Mesopotamia showed the world that civilization was not only about building cities or conquering territory. It was also about defining rules, recording obligations, and making justice part of the machinery of the state. But law did not end violence in Mesopotamia. It only gave civilization a stronger shape before the next great storm arrived from the north. From the north came the Assyrians, and with them came a new level of organized violence. Centered first around Assur and later Nineveh, the Assyrians built one of the most feared military systems of the ancient world. They were not terrifying simply because they fought well. They were terrifying because they turned warfare into a disciplined technology of empire. They used iron weapons on a large scale, perfected siege warfare, and maintained a professional army that could campaign with a consistency earlier kingdoms rarely matched. Their conquests were not chaotic raids. They were methodical operations. What made Assyrian power especially brutal was what happened after victory. Conquered peoples were often deported en masse, uprooted from their homes and resettled far away. This was not random cruelty. It was policy. By breaking populations apart, the Assyrians made rebellion harder and imperial control easier. They understood that power was not only about defeating armies, it was about reorganizing human geography itself. Then came one of the most shocking acts in Mesopotamian history. In 689 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib destroyed Babylon. Not merely conquered it, but devastated it so thoroughly that the event stunned the ancient world. Babylon was more than a city. It was a symbol, a center of memory, religion, and prestige. To erase it was to attack the identity of Mesopotamian civilization itself. And yet, Babylon returned. That is one of the deepest patterns in Iraq's history. Destruction, followed by rebirth. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon rose again and reached a level of magnificence that became legendary. Its walls, gates, and ceremonial roads impressed travelers across the ancient world. The Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant glazed bricks and sacred animals, became one of the most iconic monuments of antiquity. Babylon was once again a center of wealth, architecture, and imperial prestige. This was also the Babylon that entered biblical memory through the conquest of Jerusalem and the exile of the Jewish population. By then, Babylon was no longer just a city in Mesopotamia. It had become an idea, a symbol of power, exile, splendor, and downfall. But even this renewed greatness would not last forever. A new empire was already approaching, and with it, the end of Mesopotamia's ancient independence. In 539 BC, the next turning point arrived almost without drama. Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon not through a long, apocalyptic siege, but with astonishing ease. To many in the city, Persian rule looked preferable to the instability and dissatisfaction of the late Babylonian court. And with that, a profound era ended. Mesopotamia did not disappear, but it ceased to exist as an independent center of political power. It became part of something larger. That pattern would continue for centuries. The Persians governed the region as one of the richest and most strategic provinces in their empire. Then came Alexander the Great, who swept through the Persian world and took Babylon in 331 BC. He was so impressed by the city that he reportedly intended to make it one of the capitals of his empire. But Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, and his vast conquests fragmented almost immediately. After him came the Seleucids, then the Parthians, then the Sassanids. Each dynasty taxed Mesopotamia, used its roads and rivers, drew wealth from its fields, and recognized its immense value. But the role of the region had changed. It was no longer the uncontested heart of a self-directed civilization. It was now a prize contested by empires stretching far beyond it. Even so, the old importance of Iraq never vanished. Whoever controlled Mesopotamia gained agriculture, trade routes, river access, and a bridge between worlds. Anatolia, Iran, Arabia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The land remained central, even when it was no longer sovereign in the ancient sense. And then, from the Arabian desert, a new force emerged with a new faith, a new language of power, and a new vision of history. That arrival would transform Iraq more permanently than the Persians or the Greeks ever had. Then came one of the greatest reversals in the history of this land. After centuries of being absorbed by outside empires, Mesopotamia became the center of a new world order. In 637 AD, Arab armies defeated the Sassanid Persians, and Iraq became part of the expanding Islamic Caliphate. But conquest was only the beginning. What truly transformed the region was the rise of Baghdad. In 762 AD, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur founded a new capital on the Tigris and called it the City of Peace. The world would remember it as Baghdad. Within decades, it grew into the largest city on earth, a place of markets, palaces, libraries, workshops, and scholars from every direction of the known world. Baghdad was not important only because it was rich. It was important because it became a machine for collecting and expanding knowledge. At the center of that achievement stood the House of Wisdom, where texts from Greek, Persian, Indian, and earlier Mesopotamian traditions were translated, studied, debated, and improved. This was not passive preservation. Baghdad did not merely store the inheritance of older civilizations. It reworked it and pushed it forward. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and philosophy all flourished there. One of the most influential figures of this age was al-Khwarizmi, whose work helped systematize algebra. His name would later give the world the word algorithm. That alone tells you how deeply Baghdad still lives inside the modern world. The scientific culture of Abbasid Iraq shaped ideas that would travel across continents and centuries. While much of Europe was still politically fragmented and intellectually limited, Baghdad stood as the intellectual capital of the planet. This is what makes Iraq's history so extraordinary. The same land that had given the world its first cities now helped lead one of humanity's greatest ages of scholarship. Ancient Mesopotamia had once invented civilization's foundations. Abbasid Baghdad helped preserve and refine civilization's knowledge. But brilliance in Iraqi history was rarely left unchallenged. At the height of Baghdad's fame, another storm was already gathering from the east. That storm broke in 1258, when Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived at Baghdad with the Mongol army. What followed was one of the most devastating single events in the history of civilization. Baghdad was sacked, its libraries destroyed, its scholars killed, and its intellectual heart ripped open. The House of Wisdom, which had gathered centuries of learning from across the known world, was shattered. Manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris, and later writers said the river ran dark with ink. Whether every detail of that image is literal or not, its meaning is unmistakable. One of the world's greatest centers of knowledge had been broken. The destruction reached beyond books. The irrigation networks that had sustained life in Mesopotamia for thousands of years were damaged and neglected, helping turn fertile land into decline. Baghdad survived as a city, but the age in which it stood at the center of the world was over. Later, conquerors and dynasties would still rule Iraq, including Timur and then the Ottomans, who controlled the region for centuries. But by then, the land between the rivers had changed status. It was no longer the unquestioned center of world learning or imperial innovation. It had become a frontier, a contested space, fought over by larger powers and slowly drained of the density that had once made it extraordinary. Still, even in decline, Iraq remained what it had always been: too valuable, too strategic, and too deeply rooted in history to be ignored. And in the 20th century, after centuries of imperial rule, the map would change again. This time, the change would come not from ancient kings or steppe conquerors, but from European empires drawing borders across the ruins of older worlds. The consequences of those lines would shape Iraq's next century more violently than anyone could have imagined. In 1920, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Britain drew a state on the map and called it Iraq. It stitched together 3 Ottoman provinces: Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra in the south. It looked like a country to the outside world. In reality, it was a construction forced over populations with histories, identities, and power structures. A monarchy was installed. Then came unrest, revolution in 1958, coups, and the rise of the Ba'ath Party. By 1979, Saddam Hussein stood at the top of the state, and Iraq entered one of its darkest chapters in modern history. Within a year, Saddam had launched war against Iran. It lasted 8 years, consumed wealth, and killed hundreds of thousands. Then came the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the Gulf War, and the sanctions that followed through the 1990s, hollowing out life. In 2003, America invaded Iraq on the claim that Saddam possessed WMDs. Those weapons were never found. The regime fell quickly, but the collapse of the state unleashed forces that would scar the country for decades: insurgency, sectarian war, militia rule, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and eventually ISIS. When ISIS captured Mosul in 2014 and declared a caliphate on Mesopotamian soil, The symbolism was unbearable. A land that had once given the world writing, law, and civilization was being presented to the world through images of execution, rubble, and fanaticism. Ruins were smashed. Museums were looted. Historical memory itself became a target. It was not enough to control territory. The extremists wanted to erase the evidence that Iraq had been a crossroads of civilizations long before them. But this is where the story has to be told carefully. Iraq is not only a catalog of invasions and disasters, it is also one of the clearest examples in history of human continuity under pressure. Through dictatorship, war, occupation, terrorism, and economic collapse, Iraqis kept living. They kept marrying, praying, trading, rebuilding, mourning, and raising children. Cities like Najaf and Karbala remained centers of faith for millions. The marshes of Iraq, devastated in the 1990s, began to recover after 2003. Life returned, water returned, birds returned. That is the deeper pattern of Iraq. Sumer fell and others rose. Babylon was shattered and rebuilt. Baghdad burned and endured. Modern Iraq has been wounded repeatedly, but it has never been emptied and never fully erased. The world often sees Iraq through the lens of catastrophe. History sees something larger, one of the oldest inhabited landscapes on Earth, still carrying the weight of what it gave humanity. The question was never whether Iraq could survive. It has survived everything. The real question, as it has always been, is what this land will build next.